Section 14 of Great Events in the History of North and South America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Great Events in the History of North and South America by Charles Goodrich. Chapter 5. English and Narragansetts. The Narragansetts were considered a great nation among the Indians. The territory of their sachem extended about 30 or 40 miles from Seekonk River and Narragansett Bay, including Rhode Island and other islands in that bay. Pawcatuck River separated it from the Pequods. Under the rule of Canonicus in 1642, this nation was at the height of its greatness, and was supposed to embrace a population of 30,000 inhabitants. He was sachem of the tribe at the time of the landing of the Fathers on the shores of New England, and continued in this capacity to the time of his death in 1647. He died, it is believed, at a very advanced age. At the period of the settlement of Plymouth, the Wampanoags were in great fear of the Narragansetts, and at one time war actually existed. During its continuance, Massasoit fled before Canonicus and sought the protection of the English. The Narragansetts at an early period were not disinclined to seek a quarrel with the English. In view of the weakness of the latter, they began to utter threats, although the summer preceding they had desired and obtained peace. They deemed it a favorable opportunity for their purpose, as the English had just received an addition to their numbers, but not to their arms or provisions, a circumstance of which the Indians were advised. Their desire or intention was definitely made known by the following significant circumstance. In February 1622, Canonicus sent a man, accompanied by one Tocamahamon, a friendly Indian, into Plymouth, bringing with him a bundle of arrows bound with a rattlesnake's skin, and leaving them there, immediately left the place. When Squanto was made acquainted with the incident, he informed the English that it was a challenge for war. The governor, Bradford, taking the rattlesnake's skin and filling it with powder and shot, returned it to Canonicus. At the same time he instructed the messenger to bid him defiance and dare him to the combat. This had the desired effect upon the Indian sachem. He refused to receive the skin, as also the other chiefs, until it was at last returned to Plymouth. Canonicus was evidently awed by the hostile bearing and threat of the English. Not long after this affair, the Pequods proposed to the Narragansetts to join them in rooting out the English, on the ground that if the Pequods were once destroyed, the ruin of the Narragansetts was sure to follow. The English would want their lands. They were spreading fast. But a timely combination would save both tribes and their inheritance. On these politic representations, the historian Hubbard cleverly remarks that McIvell himself, if he had sat in council with them, could not have insinuated stronger reasons to have persuaded them to a peace. It is said that the Narragansetts felt the force of them, and were almost persuaded to accede to the proposal, and to join with the others against the English. But when they considered what an advantage they had put in their hands, by the power and favor of the English, to take full revenge of all their former injuries upon their inveterate enemies, the thought of that was so sweet that it decided their hesitating minds. The governor of Massachusetts, in order to prevent a union between these savage nations, and to strengthen the bands of peace between the Narragansett Indians and the colony, sent for Miantonimo, who was their sachem in connection with Canonicus, inviting him to come to Boston. Upon this, Miantonimo, together with 2 of the sons of Canonicus, another sachem, and a number of their men, went to Boston, and entered into a treaty to the following effect: that there should be a firm peace between them and the English and their posterity, that neither party should make peace with the Pequots without the consent of the other, that they should not harbor the Pequots, and that they should return all fugitive servants, and deliver over to the English, or put to death, all murderers. The English were to give them notice when they went out against the Pequots, and they were to furnish them with guides. It was also stipulated that a free trade should be maintained between the parties. These articles were indifferently well observed by the Narragansetts, till their enemies the Pequots were totally subdued. But after that event they began to grow insolent and treacherous, especially Maiantonimo himself. The English seem always to have been more favorably disposed towards other tribes than to the Narragansetts, as appears from the interest they took in the wars between them and their enemies. As long as the other tribes succeeded against them, the English took no part in the contests. But whenever the Narragansetts prevailed, they were ready to intercede. After the period of the Pequot War in 1637, the Narragansetts were the most numerous and powerful of the Indian tribes in this part of the country. Conscious of their power, and discontented that the whole sovereignty over the rest of the Indians was not adjudged to belong to them, or envious that Uncas, the chief sachem of the Mohegans, had gained the favor of the English more than themselves, they constantly sought occasions of disagreement with the Mohegans. This was in contravention of an agreement made between the English and the Narragansetts in the year 1637, when they had helped to destroy the Pequots, and also the Triple League between the English, Mohegans, and Narragansetts entered into at Hartford in 1638. The Narragansetts seem to owe a special spite against Uncas and the Mohegans from the time of the distribution of the Pequots after the termination of the war. They had probably expected the whole management of that affair for themselves. They therefore found occasions of quarrel with Uncas, and were hardly kept from making open war with him, when they saw all other attempts to destroy him by treachery, poison, and sorcery had failed. The Mohegans, though a less numerous and powerful people than the Narragansetts, were yet more warlike in character and more politic in their intercourse with the whites. The disposition of Maiantonimo was haughty and aspiring, and he seemed to infuse the same spirit into the minds of his people. He possessed a fine figure, was tall of stature, and was a master of cunning and subtlety. It was strongly suspected that, in the year 1642, he had contrived to draw all the Indians throughout the country into a general conspiracy against the English. Letters from Connecticut, received at Boston, had announced the existence of such a conspiracy, and even the details of it were given. The time appointed for the assault was said to be after harvest; the manner to be by several companies entering into the houses of the principal men, professedly for the purposes of trade, and then to kill them there; one company seizing their arms, and others being at hand to prosecute the massacre. It was urged on the part of Connecticut that war should be begun with them, and that if Massachusetts would send 120 men to Saybrook, at the mouth of the river, they would meet them with a proportionable number. Though there was a probability in the stories afloat respecting the Narragansetts, yet the General Court of Massachusetts did not think the information to be a sufficient ground for commencing a war. The court, however, ordered that the Indians within their jurisdiction should be disarmed, and to this they willingly assented. The sachem of the Narragansetts was, moreover, sent for to Boston, and by his readiness to appear, confirmed the English in the opinion that nothing had as yet occurred which could be construed into a justifiable cause of war. The sachem's quarrel with the Mohegans would very naturally render them a subject of such a report, whether there was a foundation for it or not. Maiantonimo very consistently urged before the court that his accusers should be confronted to him, and their allegations sifted, so that the truth might be ascertained, that if they could not prove their charges, they might receive the punishment which was their due, and which would have been inflicted on himself if found guilty, that is, death; and that as the English must have believed the report because they ordered the disarming of the Indians, so equity required that they who accused him should be punished according to the offense charged upon his own person. He, moreover, engaged to prove that the report was raised by Uncas himself or some of his people. On the part of English, the disarming of the Indians was excused on the ground that Englishmen's houses had been robbed in several instances by the Indians, which was a consideration that somewhat satisfied the chief. The Connecticut people yielded, though with reluctance, to the decision of the Massachusetts court. They spent 2 days in making a treaty of peace, the delay being occasioned by the difficulty of obtaining Maiantonimo's consent to a portion of the stipulations. It was, however, effected to the satisfaction of the English. Indian hostages were given for its performance, and, excepting a company stationed in the Mohegan country for the protection of Uncas, the whites laid aside warlike preparations. In the year 1643, Maiantonimo invaded the Mohegans with 900 of his warriors. Uncas met him at the head of 500 of his men on a large plain. Both prepared for action and advanced within bow shot. Before the conflict commenced, Uncas advanced singly, and thus addressed his antagonist: "You have a number of men with you, and so have I with me. It is a pity that such brave warriors should be killed in a private quarrel between us. Come like a man, as you profess to be, and let us fight it out. If you kill me, my men shall be yours, but if I kill you, your men shall be mine." Maiantonimo replied, "My men came to fight, and they shall fight." Uncas had before told his men that if his enemy should refuse to fight with him personally, he would fall down, and then they were to discharge their missiles on the Narragansetts, and fall upon them as fast as they could. This was accordingly done. Uncas instantly fell upon the ground, and his men poured a shower of arrows upon Maiantonimo's army, and with a horrible yell advanced rapidly upon them and put them to flight. Uncas and his men pressed on, driving them down ledges of rock, and scattering them in every direction. Maiantonimo was overtaken and seized by Uncas, who, by a shout, called back his furious warriors. About 30 Narragansetts were slain, among whom were several noted chiefs. Finding himself in the hands of his implacable enemy, Maiantonimo remained silent, nor could Uncas by any art force him to break his sullen mood. "Had you taken me," said the conqueror, "I should have asked you for my life." No reply was made by the indignant chief, and he submitted without a murmur to his humiliating condition. He was afterwards conducted to Hartford by his conqueror, and delivered to the English, by whom he was held in duress until his fate should be determined by the commissioners of the colonies. After an examination of his case, the commissioners resolved that as it was evident that Uncas could not be safe while Maiantonimo lived, but either by secret treachery or open force his life would be constantly in danger, he might justly put such a false and bloodthirsty enemy to death, but this was to be done out of the English jurisdiction, and without cruelty or torture. Maiantonimo was delivered to Uncas, and by a number of his trusty men was marched to the spot where he was captured, attended by 2 Englishmen, to see that no torture was inflicted, and the moment he arrived at the fatal place, one of Uncas's men came up behind, and with his hatchet split the skull of the unfortunate chief. The body was buried on the spot, and a heap of stones piled upon the grave. The place since that time has been known by the name of Sachem's Plain, and is situated in the town of Norwich in Connecticut. The Narragansetts, as was to be expected, ever afterwards bore an implacable malice against Uncas and all the Mohegans, and also for their sakes secretly against the English, so far as they dared to discover it. But the death of Meantonimo and the preparation for the invasion of the Narragansett country by the English, which had been made, put an end to hostilities for a period in the eastern part of Connecticut. In continuing the Narragansett history, Ninigret now properly comes into view. As already mentioned, he was sachem of the Neantics, a tribe of the Narragansetts. In 1644, the Narragansetts and Ninigret's men united against the Mohegans, and for some time obliged Uncas to confine himself and men to his fort. The Indians, however, afraid of the English, abandoned the siege, and came into Boston to sue for peace. This was granted, but a short time after it became necessary to again terrify them. With 20 men, Captain Atherton marched to the wigwam of Ninigret, entering which he seized the chief and threatened his life. This step had the desired effect. The Indians begged for life and promised submission. Some time after this occurrence, Ninigret again grew troublesome, and again had to be quieted by an armed force sent against him. In the panic with which he was affected, he submitted to the demands that were laid upon him. Ninigret passed the winter of 1652–53 among the Dutch of New York. This circumstance awakened the suspicions of the English, especially as hostile feelings existed at that time between the Dutch and English. The report from several Sagamores was that the Dutch governor had attempted to hire them to cut off the English. The consequence was a special meeting of the English commissioners of the several New England colonies to consult in reference to this subject. Their object was to ascertain the truth of the rumor that the Narragansetts had leagued with the Dutch to break up the English settlements. Several of the chiefs of the Narragansetts were accordingly questioned by a letter, through an agent living at the Narragansett, in regard to this plot, but their answers were altogether exculpatory. As to any other positive testimony that Ninigret was plotting against the English, there appears to be none. In the year 1652, a war having commenced between England and Holland, it was apprehended that hostilities would take place between the colonies of the two nations in America. A threatening attitude was indeed held for some time by the Dutch of New Netherlands, and forces were raised by the 4 New England colonies, but no collision occurred. In the event of hostilities, it was believed that the sachem Ninigret would lead the Narragansetts to the aid of the Dutch, and that he had held a conference with them at Manhattan in the winter of 1652. Whether that was the case or not, he refused for some time after to treat with the English for a continuance of the peace. Under these threatening appearances, the commissioners of the colonies met, and resolved to raise 270 infantry and 40 cavalry for the purpose of chastising Ninigret's haughtiness, and bringing the Narragansetts to terms. The forces were duly apportioned among the colonies. Massachusetts had been at first reluctant, but finally assented to the measure. The commissioners nominated Major Gibbons, Major Dennison, or Captain Atherton to the chief command, leaving it in complaisance to the General Court of Massachusetts to appoint which one of the 3 they should please. But rejecting these, who were men of known courage and enterprise, they appointed Major Simon Willard. The commissioners instructed him to proceed, with such troops as should be found, at the place of general rendezvous, by the 13th of October, directly to Ninigret's quarters, and demand of him the Pequots who had been put under him, and the tribute which was due. If Ninigret should not deliver them, and pay the tribute, he was required to take them by force. He was instructed to demand of the sachem a cessation from all further hostilities against the Long Island Indians. Receiving these and some other instructions, he proceeded into the Narragansett country. When he arrived at the place of rendezvous, he found that Ninigret had fled into a swamp about 15 miles distant. The latter had left his country, corn, and wigwams without defense, and they might have been laid waste without danger or loss. He, however, returned without ever advancing from his headquarters, or doing the enemy the least damage. About 100 Pequots took this opportunity to renounce the government of Ninigret, and come off with the English army, putting themselves under the control of the whites. The commissioners in favor of the expedition were dissatisfied with the conduct of Major Willard, and charged him with having neglected a fair opportunity of chastising the Indians by the destruction of their dwellings and their fields of corn. He, however, pleaded in excuse that his instructions were equivocal, and the season for marching unfavorable. By many people in Connecticut and New Haven it was believed that the commander was secretly instructed by the government of Massachusetts to avoid depredations on the property of the Indians, and thereby prevent a war, which the latter colony considered to be of doubtful policy. However this may be, it is certain that Major Willard received no censure from the Massachusetts court, and no one doubted his firmness as an officer. After the return of the English troops from the Narragansett country, Ninigret assumed his former spirit of defiance, and continued the war against the Indians upon Long Island. Both the Indians and the English there were soon thrown into great distress. It became apparent that these Indians could not hold out much longer, but that they must submit themselves and their country to the Narragansetts, unless they should receive speedy aid. In consequence of this state of things, and as these Indians were in alliance with the colonies, measures were taken to aid them against Ninigret. An armed vessel was stationed off Montauk to watch his movements, and forces were held in readiness at Saybrook and New London to move on the shortest notice, should the hostile chief again attempt to invade the island. Hostilities, however, continued some time, and the tribes in various directions exhibited a strange, changeable conduct. Uncas, in this exigency, was so pressed by the Narragansetts that Connecticut was obliged to send men to his fortress to assist in defending himself against them. The Narragansetts, in several instances, threatened and plundered the inhabitants of Connecticut. In 1657 some mischief was done at Farmington, in which the Norwottuck and Pocomatuck Indians were supposed to be accomplices. Even the Mohegans under Uncas also partook of the hostile spirit, and an assault was made by them upon the Podunk Indians at Windsor. At length the Long Island Indians turned against their friends on the island, and Major Mason was ordered with a force for the protection of the English in that quarter. At last the war, and the difficulties in regard to the Narragansetts, having ceased for a period, the English were once more left to pursue the arts of peace, and consummate their labors for colonizing the country. Section 14.